The promise was a whisper against the oppressive silence of the sick room, a vow made not to him, but over him. Duke Alistair Beaumont lay still, a prisoner beneath the damp weight of linen sheets, his body a furnace of fever. He feigned a deeper sleep than the illness afforded him, his lashes a dark fringe against the unnaturally pale skin of his cheeks. He had learned in the last week that stillness was a currency, and listening, a form of penance. Through the narrow slit of his barely open eyes, he watched the woman he had wronged, the woman he had spent 6 years searching for, as she knelt by the crude cot he now occupied. Her name was Eleanor, though the world he had forced her into called her Ellen. She was smoothing the hair back from their son's forehead. Thomas, a simple, strong name. A name without the weight of a dukedom attached to it. The boy's small face was a mask of worry. His eyes, Alistair's eyes, a startling flash of Beaumont blue in a face that was all his mother's, were fixed on his father's still form. "He will be well, Mama." Thomas's voice was a small, fragile thing in the room that smelled of boiled herbs and the salty damp of the sea. Eleanor's hand never stopped its gentle motion. "He is strong, my love. The fever will break." "But if it does not?" Alistair's heart, a slow, heavy drum in his chest, seemed to falter. He heard Eleanor draw a careful breath. She thought him lost to delirium, a man adrift on a burning sea. He was not. He was achingly, horribly present. "Then we shall endure," she whispered. Her voice meant only for their son, yet it struck Alistair like a physical blow. "As we always have. You and I. I will keep you safe. I promise you that. No man's pride, no man's foolishness will ever touch you. I will work my fingers to the bone. I will scrub floors until my knees bleed. But you will be safe. You will be loved. That is my vow to you." It was not a comfort. It was a condemnation, a promise forged in the fires of his failure. In that moment, with the fever raging through his veins, Duke Alistair Beaumont understood the true depth of the chasm he had blasted between them 6 years ago. It was not a misunderstanding to be bridged with apologies and jewels. It was a wound that had scarred over into a fierce, unyielding strength that had no need of him. He heard what she promised his son, and in it he heard his own damnation, and his first, desperate prayer for a path to redemption. 6 years earlier, the air in Blackwood Manor had been thick enough to drink. It was a concoction of beeswax, wilting roses, and the cloying perfume of obligation. Alistair moved through the gilded rooms of his ancestral home, like a ghost, haunting his own life. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a title that felt less like an honor, and more like a suit of armor he could never remove. It was heavy, it was cold, and it kept everyone, especially his own wife, at a pristine, unbreachable distance. Eleanor, his duchess, was another perfect acquisition. She was beautiful, impeccably bred, and possessed a quiet grace that society applauded. He observed her across dinner tables and crowded ballrooms, a masterpiece in silk and pearls. He saw the elegant line of her throat, the gentle curve of her smile, but he never truly looked at her. He never saw the loneliness that swam in the deep gray of her eyes, or the way her hands would clench in the folds of her gown when his younger brother, Lord Frederick, drew near. Frederick was a shadow at Alistair's elbow, his whispers a constant, venomous drip. "She seems tired, brother. Perhaps the duties of a duchess are too much for her delicate constitution." Or, "I saw her speaking with Captain Marlowe in the gardens. An old acquaintance," she said. "One must be so careful of old acquaintances." Alistair, consumed by the endless demands of his estates, his tenants, and his political responsibilities, absorbed the poison without recognizing it for what it was. He was a man who understood ledgers and laws, not the subtle machinations of a jealous heart. He saw Eleanor's quietness not as dignified suffering, but as confirmation of Frederick's insinuations. He saw her pallor not as the first sign of a nascent life growing within her, but as evidence of a secret melancholy, a discontent he was too busy, too important to address. The oppression was a physical thing. It was in the suffocating whalebone of Eleanor's corsets, mirroring the strictures of her life. It was in the ticking of a dozen grandfather clocks, each one marking a moment of a life unlived. The rain that lashed against the tall, mullioned windows of Blackwood seemed to weep for her, streaking the glass like tears. She felt trapped, a rare bird in a vast, cold cage, and her keeper did not even notice the dimming of her plumage. One afternoon, the oppressive atmosphere finally coalesced into a storm. Alistair was in his study, a mountain of paperwork before him, the scent of leather and ink his only comfort. Frederick burst in, his face a carefully constructed mask of distress and brotherly concern. "Alistair, you must come, at once." "I am occupied, Frederick. What is it?" Alistair did not look up, his pen scratching across a lease agreement. "It is the Duchess, in the West Pavilion, with Captain Marlowe." The name was dropped like a stone into a still pond. Alistair froze. The scratching of his pen ceased. He looked up, his blue eyes cold and sharp. Frederick's words, 100 whispers over 100 nights, suddenly found their mark. They formed a narrative of betrayal that his own emotional negligence had left him vulnerable to believe. He did not question. He did not pause. He rose, his chair scraping harshly against the polished floor, and followed his brother. The West Pavilion was a small, glass-walled folly at the edge of the formal gardens, usually reserved for afternoon tea on sunny days. On this gray, drizzling afternoon, it looked forlorn. Through the rain-streaked glass, Alistair saw them. Eleanor, her back to the door, and Captain Marlowe, a man with a tarnished reputation and gambling debts, standing far too close. As Alistair watched, Marlowe reached out and grasped Eleanor's arm. A cold, clean rage, sharp as a shard of ice, pierced through Alistair's detachment. He did not see Eleanor flinch away. He did not see the panic in her eyes. He saw only the confirmation of his brother's poison. He threw the doors open. The sound cracked through the quiet air. Eleanor spun around, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief at his appearance. Marlowe dropped her arm as if it were hot iron. "Your Grace," Marlowe stammered, bowing low. Alistair ignored him. His gaze was fixed on his wife. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice was dangerously soft, colder than the rain. "Alistair, thank heavens. This man, he followed me here. He was demanding money." Eleanor's voice trembled, but there was truth in it, a desperate plea for him to see. But Alistair did not see her. He saw the scene Frederick had painted for him. He saw a clandestine meeting, a secret lover. His pride, a monolithic and fragile thing, was wounded. Money, or payment for services rendered? The words were out before he could stop them, ugly and corrosive. The world stopped. For Eleanor, the sound in the room vanished. The drumming of the rain, the panicked breathing of the captain, her own frantic heartbeat. It all faded into a profound and terrifying silence. All that existed was Alistair's face, a mask of cold fury, and his words, which had just annihilated her world. He had not asked. He had not defended. He had judged and condemned her in a single, brutal breath. The color drained from her face, leaving it as white as marble. Her trembling ceased, replaced by a stillness that was far more profound than any swoon. A cold, acidic nausea rose in her throat. This was not a fight she could win. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a betrayal so complete, so absolute, that it felt like the end of life itself. Her husband, the man who had vowed to protect her, stood before her as her executioner. "I see," she said, her voice a hollow whisper that was somehow louder than a scream. And in that moment, she was no longer his duchess. She was a woman utterly and completely alone. That night, Blackwood Manor was a tomb, a silent, suffocating monument to her humiliation. Eleanor sat before her vanity, not seeing the reflection of the Duchess of Blackwood in the silvered glass. That woman was a ghost, a fiction that had been violently erased in the West Pavilion. She saw only a survivor. The decision was not born of hysterics or tears. The time for tears was past. This was a decision born of the ice that had formed around her heart. She could not stay. She could not live under the roof of a man who held her in such low esteem, who believed the whispers of a venomous snake over the woman who carried his child. Yes, the child. Her hand went to her still flat stomach. The secret sickness of the past weeks, the weariness she had mistaken for melancholy, was this: a new life, a tiny, innocent being that deserved more than a cold, loveless legacy. This child was now her only reason. It was her future, her purpose, her vow. She would not raise a child in this gilded cage, to be judged and found wanting by a father who did not know the meaning of trust. Her movements were swift, pragmatic. She did not weep over the gowns of silk and velvet. She pushed them aside, searching for her plainest traveling dress, a simple wool of dark gray. She opened her jewelry box, the diamonds and pearls winking at her like cold, dead stars. They were shackles, not adornments. She ignored them, her fingers seeking a small, hidden leather pouch at the bottom. Inside was a modest sum of money, saved over years from her personal allowance, a secret nest egg for a rainy day she had never truly imagined would come. The irony was bitter. The storm had arrived. She left the jewels scattered on the velvet lining, a silent, final rebuke. She took nothing that belonged to the Duke of Blackwood. She took only what was hers, her life, her dignity, and the secret life growing within her. She put on the simple dress, tied her hair in a severe knot, and pulled a dark cloak over her shoulders. The woman in the mirror was a stranger. Stripped of her finery, she looked younger, sterner, and more determined than the Duchess had ever been. She was no longer Lady Eleanor Beaumont. She was Ellen, a woman running for her life and for the life of her child. Under the cloak of a moonless, storm-racked night, she slipped out of a servant's entrance, a small, resolute shadow against the immense dark stone of the manor. The rain plastered her hair to her face, the wind tore at her cloak, but she did not falter. With every step she took away from Blackwood, she felt another link of her gilded chain fall away. The path was dark, the future terrifyingly uncertain, but for the first time in years, Eleanor felt the sharp, cold, exhilarating air of freedom. The journey was a blur of jolting coaches and grimy inns. She traveled north, then west, putting as much distance as she could between herself and the life that had tried to suffocate her. She spoke to no one, kept her head down, and paid for everything in cash, a ghost moving through the arteries of the country. She finally found her sanctuary in a place so remote, it felt like the edge of the world, the small, wind-swept fishing village of Port Carenza in Cornwall. It was a world away from the manicured lawns of Blackwood. Here, the air was sharp with the sting of salt and the smell of fish. The cottages were built of rugged gray stone, huddled together against the relentless Atlantic gales. The people were as rugged as their homes, their faces weathered by the sun and sea, their hands calloused from pulling nets and mending sails. There was no artifice here, no room for polite lies or subtle cruelties. Life was hard, blunt, and real. Eleanor, now simply Ellen, rented a tiny, damp cottage on the cliffs overlooking the churning sea. She used the last of her money to secure it, and then she sought work. Her soft hands and refined accent were objects of suspicion, but her desperation was a language the villagers understood. A woman named Martha, the gruff but kind-hearted wife of the local innkeeper, took pity on her. Ellen was given work mending fishing nets and doing laundry for the inn, grueling, physical labor that left her muscles screaming and her back aching. Her hands, once accustomed to needlepoint and the cool ivory of piano keys, became raw, chapped, and calloused. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees, the lye soap stinging the cuts. She hauled heavy baskets of wet linen, her arms trembling with the strain. Every evening she would collapse onto her narrow cot, every bone in her body aching with a weariness so profound it was a kind of peace. In this crucible of hardship, the fragile Duchess was burned away, leaving behind a woman of tempered steel. She was often hungry, frequently cold, but she was her own. Months later, with the help of Martha, who had become a fierce, protective friend, she gave birth to her son. She named him Thomas. He was small, perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that were a startling, familiar blue. In that moment, holding her son, Eleanor knew she had made the right choice. He was her heart, her world, her reason for enduring. She raised him in the tiny cottage, surrounded by the roar of the sea. She taught him to read, using the few books she had managed to carry with her. She taught him to be kind, to be honest, and to be strong. He was a happy child, full of laughter, and a blunt, childlike honesty that was a balm to her wounded soul. He knew nothing of dukedoms or titles. He only knew the fierce, unwavering love of his mother. Meanwhile, back at Blackwood, a different kind of crucible was at work. The manor, once merely cold, had become a mausoleum. Alistair's initial rage had curdled into a bitter, hollow ache. He had expected scandal, a confrontation, perhaps even a duel. He had not expected silence. Eleanor had simply vanished, taking the scandal with her, leaving behind only a void. Frederick, of course, was triumphant. He moved to fill the space she had left, his influence over his brother now absolute. He encouraged Alistair's cynicism, his withdrawal from society. "She was never worthy of you, brother. A flighty, foolish woman. You are better off without her." Alistair tried to believe him. He threw himself into his work with a feverish intensity, but found no solace. The silence of the house was a constant accusation. He would walk past her empty rooms, and the scent of lavender and old books that still lingered there would catch in his throat. He saw her face in his dreams, not angry, but broken, her eyes wide with a pain he had inflicted. The memory of her whispered, "I see," haunted him. Years passed. 5, then 6. The ache in Alistair's soul did not fade. It grew, a cold, hard knot of regret. The seed of doubt was planted by the smallest of things. A solicitor, going over old accounts, mentioned a large sum of money paid to Captain Marlowe from an account controlled by Frederick, dated the week after Eleanor's disappearance. A debt of honor, Frederick claimed with a dismissive wave of his hand. But the explanation felt thin. Alistair started to look closer. He remembered the look on Eleanor's face, not of guilt, but of terror. He remembered how Marlowe had seemed more afraid of her than enamored. He began a quiet, discreet investigation, hiring a man from London, a former Bow Street runner with a reputation for tenacity and silence. The agent's name was Graves, and he was methodical. He started with Captain Marlowe, who, it turned out, was living comfortably in France. Under pressure, and with the promise of protection from Lord Frederick's influence, Marlowe's story crumbled. He confessed he had been paid handsomely by Frederick to accost the Duchess in the pavilion, to create a scene. He produced letters from Frederick, outlining the entire sordid affair. The plan had been simple: to drive a wedge between Alistair and Eleanor, to isolate the Duke and secure Frederick's own position as his indispensable heir and advisor. The truth, when it was finally laid bare in a detailed report on Alistair's desk, was not a relief. It was a physical sickness. He felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. Every cruel word he had spoken, every cold glance he had given his wife, was replayed in his mind, now illuminated by the horrifying glare of his own blind, arrogant folly. He had not been betrayed by his wife. He had been the one to betray her. He had sacrificed her on the altar of his own pride, manipulated by the brother he had trusted. The agent, Graves, was not finished. He had been tasked with finding the Duchess, and he was nothing if not thorough. Following a cold trail, piecing together sightings of a lone, dark-haired woman traveling west 6 years prior, he eventually traced her to the forgotten corner of Cornwall. "She is living in a village called Port Carenza, Your Grace," Graves reported, his voice devoid of emotion. "She goes by the name of Ellen. She has a son, a boy of about 5 years, dark hair, blue eyes." Alistair felt the air leave his lungs. A son. His son. The world tilted on its axis. He had not just cast out his wife. He had abandoned his own child to a life of poverty and hardship. The weight of his failure was crushing, absolute. There was no more room for pride, no more room for anger. There was only a vast, desolate landscape of regret and a single, desperate need to find her, to see her, to somehow, impossibly atone. The journey to Port Carenza was a pilgrimage of shame. With every mile that passed, Alistair shed another layer of his ducal arrogance. The man who arrived in the wind-battered fishing village was not the powerful Duke of Blackwood. He was a penitent, a man stripped bare by the truth. He found her cottage easily enough. It was small, perched precariously on the cliff's edge, a thread of smoke rising from its stone chimney. And there she was, in the small patch of garden in front, pulling weeds from the stubborn soil. She was thinner, her face weathered by the sun and wind. Her hands were no longer the soft, pale hands of a duchess. They were the capable, work-worn hands of a survivor. She wore a simple, patched dress, and her glorious dark hair was braided simply down her back, and she was more beautiful than he had ever remembered. He stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. She had not seen him yet. And then a small boy came running from around the side of the cottage, chasing a seagull. He was laughing, a bright, carefree sound that seemed to mock the darkness in Alistair's own heart. "Mama, look! It almost let me touch it," the boy cried. Eleanor turned, a gentle, loving smile transforming her face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy, a smile he had never once seen at Blackwood. And then the boy, Thomas, stumbled and looked up. For a moment his laughter died, and his gaze met Alistair's across the short distance. The world narrowed to a single point. The boy's eyes. They were his own. The same deep, sapphire blue, the same shape, the same intensity. It was like looking at a portrait of himself as a child. It was undeniable. It was a miracle. It was a judgment. This was his son, his heir, a boy raised in poverty because of his father's monstrous pride. The sound of his own ragged breath finally broke the spell. Eleanor's head snapped up, her smile vanishing as if it had never been. Her eyes widened, not in shock, but in the instinctive, primal fear of a mother protecting her young. The soft lines of her face hardened into a mask of granite. She moved instantly, putting herself between Alistair and the boy. "Thomas, go inside," she said, her voice low and urgent, never taking her eyes off Alistair. The boy, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the air, obeyed without question, scurrying into the cottage. Now they were alone. The wind whipped around them, pulling at her dress and his coat, the roar of the sea below a fitting soundtrack to the storm that was about to break. "Eleanor," he breathed, her name a prayer and a curse on his lips. "There is no Eleanor here," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as the sea spray. "My name is Ellen. What are you doing here, Your Grace?" The formal title was a slap. He took a step forward, his hands half raised in a gesture of peace, of pleading. "I know everything. Frederick, the lies, Captain Marlowe. I know." She gave a short, bitter laugh. It was a terrible sound. "You know? You know now? 6 years later, you know? What a comfort that must be to you. Did it take you all this time to piece it together? Or did you simply grow bored of your silent house and decide to seek a new diversion?" "It was not like that," I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I was manipulated. I came to—" He faltered. To what? To apologize? To explain? The words felt laughably inadequate. "I came to beg your forgiveness." Forgiveness? She looked at him as if he were something she had found clinging to the bottom of a rock. "You want forgiveness? For destroying my life? For casting me out based on the word of a liar? For leaving me to bear and raise your son alone in poverty while you sat in your palace, drowning in your self-pity?" Each question was a blow, striking him harder than any physical assault. He had no defense. She was right. She was right about all of it. "The boy," he stammered, his gaze flickering toward the cottage door. "He is mine." "He is mine," she corrected him, her voice fierce, absolute. "I am the one who felt him kick. I'm the one who labored for 2 days to bring him into this world. I'm the one who stayed up through his fevers, who worked until my hands bled to feed him. He has my love, my protection, my name. He has nothing of yours." It was the cruelest cut of all, and the truest. He had no right to this child. He had forfeited it. "Please, Eleanor," he pleaded, the Duke of Blackwood reduced to a beggar on a cliff's edge. "Let me explain." "There is nothing to explain," she said, her voice flat and final. "You made your choice 6 years ago in the West Pavilion. Now I am making mine. Leave. Leave Port Carenza and never come back. You have no place here. We want nothing from you." She turned her back on him then and walked into the cottage, shutting the door firmly behind her. The click of the latch echoed in the sudden silence, a sound of absolute finality. Alistair stood alone on the cliff, the wind howling around him, the immensity of what he had lost, crashing down on him with the force of the waves on the rocks below. He had found her, only to lose her all over again. But he did not leave. He could not. To leave now would be to compound his first abandonment with a second. It would be to accept the damnation she had handed him. He walked back to the village, his steps heavy, his soul a barren wasteland. At the small, salt-scrubbed inn run by Martha and her husband, he rented a room. It was tiny, with a lumpy bed and a single window that looked out not toward the sea, but toward the damp stone wall of the building next door. It was a cell, and it was fitting. He sent a message to Graves in London, instructing him to proceed. "Expose everything. See that my brother is dealt with. Spare no expense in clearing the Duchess's name. Publicly." Then he waited, and he began his penance. He did not approach her again. He respected the boundary she had drawn. Instead, he made his presence a quiet, constant fact. The villagers watched him with deep suspicion. A lord in their midst was an unwelcome oddity. But he did not act like a lord. He saw that the roof of her cottage was missing slates, a clear invitation to the relentless Cornish rain. He paid a local man, a roofer, double his usual rate to fix it, instructing him to say only that the church fund was paying for repairs for the widows and single women of the village. He saw her struggling to chop the driftwood she gathered for her fire. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, a neatly stacked cord of dry, seasoned firewood appeared by her door. He saw the worn-out soles of his son's shoes. A new pair, sturdy and well-made, was left with the innkeeper, Martha, with instructions to give them to Ellen, a gift from a secret admirer in the village. Eleanor knew. Of course, she knew. Each act of service was a silent message, a plea he could not speak. She accepted them with a cold, reluctant necessity. She needed the wood. Her son needed the shoes. But she gave nothing in return. No smile, no nod of acknowledgement. Her face remained a stony mask whenever she saw him in the village. He tried to approach his son once. He saw Thomas playing on the shingle beach, building a fort of stones. Alistair walked toward him slowly, his heart pounding. Thomas looked up, his blue eyes wide and curious, not yet filled with his mother's animosity. "Hello?" Alistair said, his voice hoarse. "Hello," Thomas replied, his own voice clear as a bell. "That is a fine fort." "It is for keeping out pirates," the boy said seriously. "A worthy cause." Alistair smiled, a rusty, unfamiliar movement of his facial muscles. "My name is Alistair." "I'm Thomas." Before he could say another word, Eleanor was there. She had appeared as if from the very air, her face thunderous. "Thomas, come, now." She took the boy's hand and pulled him away, her body a rigid shield between her son and the man who was his father. Alistair watched them go, the pain in his chest so sharp it was difficult to breathe. He had learned his lesson. He would not approach the boy again. He would wait. Weeks turned into a month. The relentless damp of the coastal autumn seeped into Alistair's bones. Used to the drafty but dry halls of Blackwood, his body was unprepared for the pervasive chill of Port Carenza. A cold took root in his chest, and fueled by exhaustion, poor food, and the heavy weight on his soul, it blossomed into a raging fever. He collapsed one evening in the common room of the inn. He remembered the innkeeper's worried face, the feeling of being half carried up the stairs, and then nothing but a confusing, burning haze. He drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the village doctor muttering about inflammation of the lungs, of cool cloths on his forehead, of bitter concoctions forced between his lips, and then, through the fog, he became aware of her. Eleanor. She was there, in his room. He could smell her scent, a faint mix of soap and sea salt. He could hear the soft rustle of her dress. His heart, which had felt so sluggish, began to beat a little faster. He kept his eyes closed, afraid that if he opened them, she would vanish. He heard her speaking in low tones with Martha, the innkeeper. "He is a fool to stay here. He will kill himself with this foolishness." "Perhaps, my dear," Martha's gruff voice replied. "Or perhaps he is finally learning what it means to care for something more than his own pride." Later, he heard his son's small voice. Thomas had come with her. The thought sent a jolt of warmth through his feverish body. His son was here, in his room. He fought the urge to open his eyes, to look at the boy. He knew it would frighten him. So he lay still, breathing shallowly, and listened. That was when it happened. That was when he heard her make the promise to their son. He heard her vow to protect Thomas from the world, from foolish men, from him. He heard the fierce, unbreakable love in her voice, a love he had inspired only by his absence. Every word was a brand on his soul, searing away the last vestiges of his ducal arrogance. He was not a duke in this room. He was just a man, a father, who had failed in his most fundamental duty. The fever burned, but the shame burned hotter. In the darkness behind his own eyelids, Alistair Beaumont finally broke, and in breaking, he began to heal. The fever broke 2 days later. He woke to a world that seemed quieter, cleaner. The fire in his lungs had subsided to a dull ache. He opened his eyes and found Eleanor sitting in a chair by his bed, her hands busy mending one of Thomas's small shirts. The morning light from the window caught the silver threads in her dark hair he had never noticed before. She looked tired, her face etched with worry, but the granite hardness was gone, replaced by a weary softness. She looked up and saw he was awake. Her fingers stilled. "You are awake," she stated, her voice neutral. "Yes." His own voice was a dry rasp. "You stayed." "My son was worried about you," she said, deflecting, "and Martha needed help. You're a difficult patient." He knew it was more than that. He had seen the chink in her armor. "Thank you," he said simply. There were no other words. He recovered slowly. Eleanor continued to visit, bringing him broth from the inn kitchen, changing his linens, saying little. The silence between them was no longer a wall of anger, but something more fragile, more contemplative. He did not push. He did not plead his case. He simply accepted her presence as the gift it was. A letter arrived from his solicitor. Frederick had been dealt with. Faced with Marlowe's signed confession and the evidence of the bank transfers, he had crumbled. The scandal was contained within the family, but the consequences were absolute. Frederick was stripped of his titles and income, banished to an obscure corner of the continent with just enough money to live, but never enough to reclaim his former life. The solicitor also enclosed clippings from the London papers. Under the guise of correcting old gossip, carefully worded articles had been placed, speaking of the Duchess's long convalescence in the country due to a nervous ailment following a misunderstanding, completely exonerating her of any wrongdoing. Her name was cleared. He showed the letter and the clippings to her. She read them without comment, her expression unreadable. She folded them neatly and handed them back. "So, it is done," she said. "My honor is restored in the eyes of a society I no longer belong to." "It was the least I could do," he said quietly. "It changes nothing of what I did, I know that. But the truth needed to be told." She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "Thank you, Alistair." It was the first time she had used his name since his arrival. It felt like a pardon. The turning point, the true moment of vulnerability, came a week later. He was finally strong enough to leave his room and was sitting on a bench outside the inn, watching the gulls circle in the sky. Thomas was playing nearby, daring the small waves to touch his boots. The boy slipped on a wet rock and went down hard, his cry of pain sharp and immediate. Before Eleanor could even rise from the doorway where she was speaking with Martha, Alistair was moving. He was not as fast as he once was, his legs still unsteady, but he reached the boy in seconds. He knelt in the wet sand, ignoring the strain on his own recovering body. "Let me see, Thomas. Let me see," he said gently. Thomas, crying more from shock than pain, held up a knee that was scraped and bleeding. Alistair, without thinking, tore a strip from his own clean handkerchief. He dipped it in a clean rock pool, the cold water making him hiss and gently, carefully, dabbed the wound clean. "There now," he murmured, his voice soft. "It is just a scratch, a brave soldier's wound. You are a very brave soldier." Thomas's sobs subsided into sniffles. He looked at Alistair, his blue eyes wide and trusting. "It does not hurt so much now." Alistair's heart felt like it would break. He looked up and saw Eleanor standing a few feet away, her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were not angry. They were filled with a bewildering mix of emotions and shining with unshed tears. She had not seen a duke tending to his heir. She had seen a father comforting his son. It was a simple, unguarded act of tenderness, more powerful than any grand gesture or apology. That evening she came to him, not to his room at the inn, but she found him walking on the cliffs, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. "He is asking for you," she said without preamble. Alistair's breath caught. "Thomas?" "He calls you the sad man who is kind. He wants to know if you will tell him a story tomorrow." He could only nod, his throat too thick with emotion to speak. They stood in silence for a long moment, the sea roaring below them. "I heard you," he said finally, his voice low. "In the sick room. I was not asleep. I heard your promise to him." Eleanor stiffened, but did not turn away. "I heard you vow to protect him from my foolishness," he continued, forcing himself to speak the shameful words. "And you were right to do so. I had given you no reason to believe otherwise. But I want to make a new vow, Eleanor, not just to him, but to you. I will spend the rest of my life earning the right to stand beside you, to help you keep that promise. I will never again be the man who believes a lie because his pride is wounded. I will be the man who trusts you, who honors you, and who loves you, if you will let me." She was quiet for so long that he thought she would reject him again. He braced himself for the blow. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "I do not know that woman, the Duchess, anymore, Alistair. I buried her a long time ago. I am Ellen. I am a woman who knows how to mend nets and scrub floors and raise a son on her own." "I know," he said, "and she is magnificent. I am not asking the Duchess to come back to Blackwood. I'm asking Ellen if she would allow Alistair to court her, here, or anywhere you choose. I'm asking if you and I and our son can build something new, something real." She finally turned to look at him. The tears were tracking down her cheeks, but for the first time, he saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It was reluctant, it was cautious, but it was there. "It will not be easy," she whispered. "The trust, it is broken." "I will earn it," he vowed. "Every day, for the rest of our lives." It was a deliberate choice, not a surrender. It was a conscious decision to believe that the man standing before her, humbled and stripped of his arrogance, was true. It was an act of courage far greater than her flight from Blackwood had been. "Tomorrow, then," she said, a watery smile touching her lips. "You can tell him a story about pirates." They did not return to Blackwood for another year. They stayed in Port Carenza, in the small cottage on the cliff. Alistair lived at the inn, and every day he courted his wife. He walked with her on the beach. He helped her in the garden. He told his son stories and taught him how to skip stones across the water. He became a familiar, quiet presence in the village, the sad man who was slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding his world. When they finally did return, it was on entirely new terms. Eleanor was not returning as a disgraced duchess being restored to her position. She was returning as a partner, a woman of strength and resilience who had chosen to forgive. Blackwood Manor was no longer a gilded cage. They filled its silent halls with laughter. Thomas's small feet ran where once only servants had scurried. Alistair, true to his word, was a changed man. His power was now tempered with humility, his wealth with compassion. Together, he and Eleanor established a foundation, a charity to aid women and children who had been unjustly cast out, who had been left with nothing. They used the pain of their past to build a better future for others. The story ended not in a grand ballroom, but years later, in the warm, fire-lit library of Blackwood. Alistair was on the floor, engaged in a mock sword fight with a 10-year-old Thomas, using rolled-up maps as their weapons. Eleanor sat in a comfortable armchair, watching them, a book forgotten in her lap. The fire crackled, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. The air smelled not of beeswax and obligation, but of old paper, burning oak, and the simple, profound peace of a family that had been broken, and had found its way back together, stronger in the mended places. She met her husband's eyes over their son's laughing head, and in his gaze she saw no trace of the cold, arrogant Duke. She saw only Alistair, her husband, a man who had earned his redemption, one small, steadfast act of love at a time.